My brother Marcus told me I'd die alone and poor, working dead-end jobs for the rest of my miserable life. He said no decent man would ever want someone like me. What he didn't know was that I was already engaged to someone worth more money than our entire family had ever seen. And when Marcus finally met him at Christmas dinner, the look on his face was worth every cruel word he'd ever said to me.
I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I restocked the shelves at Henderson's hardware store in downtown Millfield. My hands moved automatically, arranging screws and washers while my mind wandered to the text I'd received that morning. Marcus had sent another one of his messages, this time about how pathetic my job was and how I was wasting my life in a nowhere town. I'd been working at Henderson's for 3 years, ever since I graduated from Millfield Community College with an associate degree in business administration. It wasn't glamorous, but old Mr. Henderson treated me fairly, and I genuinely enjoyed helping customers find solutions to their problems. There was something satisfying about matching someone with exactly the right tool or part they needed. The bell above the door chimed, and Mrs. Rodriguez from Maple Street walked in, looking frazzled. She'd been dealing with a leaky faucet for weeks, and despite multiple trips to various stores, nothing seemed to work. I spent 20 minutes with her, asking detailed questions about her plumbing setup, examining photos on her phone, and finally identifying that she needed a specific type of O-ring that most places didn't carry. We had exactly what she needed in our specialty parts section. "Katie, you're a lifesaver," she said, clutching the small bag. "I've been to 4 other stores and nobody could figure this out." Moments like these made the job worthwhile, but I knew Marcus would never understand. He measured success purely by salary figures and status symbols. In his world, helping Mrs. Rodriguez solve her plumbing problem didn't count for anything because it didn't come with a 6-figure paycheck. Marcus worked as a regional sales manager for a pharmaceutical company in Chicago. He made good money, drove a BMW, and lived in a sleek downtown apartment. Every conversation we had somehow circled back to his latest commission check or the expensive restaurant he'd visited. He'd moved to Chicago right after college and rarely came back to visit our parents in Millfield, except for major holidays when he felt obligated to make an appearance. Our parents, Robert and Linda Pemberton, had always been proud of both of us, but Marcus seemed determined to create a hierarchy where he was the successful child and I was the disappointment. He'd started this pattern in high school, when he was the star of the debate team and I was more interested in working part-time at the local bakery. Even then, he'd make comments about how I was settling for mediocrity instead of reaching for greatness. The dynamic had only gotten worse over the years. Every family gathering became an opportunity for Marcus to showcase his achievements while subtly undermining mine. He had a particular talent for asking questions that sounded supportive on the surface, but were designed to highlight what he saw as my limitations. "So, Katie, still enjoying the hardware store?" he'd ask with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I mean, it's great that you found something that makes you happy. Not everyone needs to be ambitious, right?" Our parents would shift uncomfortably during these exchanges, but they never directly confront Marcus about his behavior. I think they hoped we'd eventually grow out of whatever sibling rivalry this was, not realizing that Marcus had turned it into something much more toxic. The worst conversation had happened 6 months ago, during a particularly brutal phone call. I'd made the mistake of mentioning that I was thinking about taking some evening classes to maybe pursue a bachelor's degree eventually. Instead of being encouraging, Marcus had launched into a 20-minute monologue about how I was delusional if I thought I could ever amount to anything significant. "Katie, let's be realistic here," he'd said, his voice taking on that condescending tone I'd grown to hate. "You're 25 years old, working retail in a town where nothing ever happens. You don't have the drive or the intelligence to compete in the real world. You're going to end up exactly where you are now, just older and more bitter about it." I'd tried to defend myself, pointing out that I was happy with my life and that success didn't have to look the same for everyone. This had only seemed to irritate him more. "Happy?" he'd scoffed. "Katie, you're stagnating. You live in the same tiny town where we grew up, you work a job that requires no real skills, and you don't even date anyone seriously. Face the facts, you're going to die alone and poor, and it'll be your own fault for never trying to be better. Those words had hit me like a physical blow. I'd ended the call abruptly and spent the rest of the evening crying on my couch, questioning everything about my choices and my future. The worst part was that some small voice in my head wondered if he might be right. But Marcus didn't know about Daniel. I'd met Daniel Richardson 3 months before that devastating phone call, though our relationship had developed slowly and privately. He'd come into Henderson's looking for some specialized equipment for a renovation project, and we'd ended up talking for over an hour about different approaches to the work he was planning.
Daniel was unlike anyone I'd ever met. He was quiet and thoughtful, with an easy smile and a genuine interest in hearing what other people had to say. He asked detailed questions about the products, not because he didn't know what he was doing, but because he wanted to understand all his options before making decisions. What struck me most was how he treated me during that first conversation. He didn't talk down to me or assume I didn't know what I was talking about. When I suggested alternative approaches to his project, he listened carefully and asked follow-up questions. He treated me like an expert in my field, which was a refreshing change from customers who assumed I was just a clerk who happened to work around tools. He came back the following week with updates on how the project was going and to pick up a few additional items. We ended up talking again, this time ranging beyond just hardware and home improvement. He mentioned that he was relatively new to Millfield, having moved there for work, and was still getting to know the area. I found myself looking forward to his visits, which became more frequent over the next few weeks. Sometimes he needed supplies for legitimate projects, but increasingly, it seemed like he was just stopping by to chat. I didn't mind at all. Our conversations were easily the highlight of my workdays. Daniel had a way of asking questions that made me think about things differently. When I mentioned that I was considering taking some college courses, he didn't immediately jump to advice or judgment. Instead, he asked what I was interested in studying and why. When I explained my ideas about maybe pursuing business management or even entrepreneurship, he nodded thoughtfully and asked more detailed questions about what kind of business I might want to run someday. "You know," he said during one of these conversations, "you have a really intuitive understanding of customer service and problem solving. Every time I've watched you help someone in here, you don't just sell them a product, you actually solve their problem. That's a rare skill." It was such a simple observation, but it meant the world to me. No one had ever pointed out that what I did at Henderson's required actual skill and expertise. Marcus certainly never acknowledged that there was any value in understanding how to help people find solutions to their practical problems. After about 6 weeks of these regular conversations, Daniel finally asked if I'd like to have dinner with him sometime. I said yes immediately, though I was nervous about it. I hadn't dated anyone seriously in over a year, and there was something about Daniel that made me want to make a good impression. Our first date was at Romano's, a small Italian restaurant on the outskirts of Millfield. Daniel was even more charming outside the hardware store setting. He was genuinely interested in my thoughts and opinions, and he shared stories about his own life and work in a way that felt natural rather than boastful. He mentioned that he worked in business development and investment, which sounded impressive but vague. When I asked for more details, he explained that he helped companies identify growth opportunities and secure funding for expansion. It seemed like interesting work, though I didn't entirely understand all the specifics. What I did understand was that Daniel made me feel valued and respected in a way I hadn't experienced before. He listened when I talked about my ideas for potentially starting my own business someday. He asked thoughtful questions about my experiences working at Henderson's and what I'd learned about customer service and small business operations. Over the next several weeks, we went on more dates, and I found myself falling for him in a way that felt both exciting and comfortable. Daniel was successful and sophisticated, but he never made me feel inadequate or small. If anything, he seemed to believe in my potential more than I believed in it myself.
We'd been dating for about 2 months when he suggested that I might want to visit him at his house sometime. I'd been wondering where he lived since he'd always picked me up for our dates or met me at restaurants. He'd mentioned that he lived outside town, but he'd been vague about the details. "It's a bit isolated," he said, seeming almost apologetic. "I value my privacy, and when I moved here, I wanted somewhere quiet where I could focus on work. I hope you don't mind the drive." The drive turned out to be about 15 minutes from downtown Millfield, winding through some of the more expensive rural areas where Millfield's wealthier residents had built homes on large lots. I'd expected Daniel to have a nice house. His clothes and car suggested he did well for himself, but I wasn't prepared for what I saw when we turned up his driveway. The house was stunning. It wasn't ostentatiously large, but everything about it spoke of careful design and expensive materials. The architecture was modern but warm, with lots of natural stone and wood. The landscaping looked professionally maintained, and there was a circular driveway that led to what appeared to be a 3-car garage. "This is your house?" I asked, trying to keep the surprise out of my voice. "It is," Daniel said, seeming to watch my reaction carefully. "I know it's probably more than what you were expecting. I hope it doesn't make you uncomfortable." I assured him that it didn't, though privately I was recalculating everything I thought I knew about Daniel's financial situation. The house had to be worth more than most people in Millfield made in several years. Combined with his car, an understated but clearly expensive sedan, and his always impeccable clothes, it was becoming clear that Daniel was significantly wealthier than I'd realized.
A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The inside of the house was even more impressive. The furnishings were elegant but comfortable, and there were details everywhere that suggested serious money. Original artwork on the walls, a kitchen that looked like something from a magazine, and a home office that was better equipped than most small businesses. "Daniel," I said as we sat in his living room with glasses of wine, "I have to ask, what exactly do you do for work? This house is incredible." He seemed to consider his response carefully before answering. "I work in private equity and investment management. I help wealthy individuals and institutions make strategic investments in companies and real estate. It's been a good career for me, financially speaking." This explanation felt more honest than his previous vague descriptions, but I still sensed he was holding something back. The house and everything about his lifestyle suggested a level of wealth that went beyond just having a good career. But I didn't want to pry too aggressively, especially since we were still getting to know each other. Over the next few weeks, our relationship deepened, and Daniel gradually shared more details about his background. He'd grown up in Connecticut, where his family had been involved in various business ventures. He'd attended an Ivy League school for both undergraduate and graduate degrees, then worked for several major investment firms before starting his own company. "I specialize in identifying undervalued assets and emerging market opportunities," he explained during one conversation. "Sometimes that means investing in small companies that have potential for growth. Sometimes it means real estate development projects. I try to diversify across different sectors and geographic regions." It sounded complicated and impressive, but what mattered more to me was how Daniel treated me and how he made me feel about myself. He never once suggested that my work at Henderson's was beneath me or that I should be ashamed of my background. If anything, he seemed to respect my practical knowledge and my ability to connect with people. 3 months into our relationship, Daniel asked if I wanted to make things official by getting engaged. The proposal was simple and perfect. He took me to the lake outside town where we'd had several picnics, and he asked me to marry him with a ring that was beautiful but not so extravagant that it would feel uncomfortable to wear. I said yes without hesitation. I was in love with Daniel, but beyond that, I felt like he saw the best version of myself and believed in my potential in a way that no one else ever had. With him, I felt like I could pursue my dreams of eventually starting my own business or going back to school without being judged or discouraged. We decided to keep our engagement relatively quiet while we figured out our timeline and plans. I told my parents, who were thrilled and immediately wanted to meet Daniel properly. I'd introduced them briefly a few weeks earlier, but they were excited to have a real conversation with their future son-in-law. The one person I didn't tell was Marcus. After his brutal phone call 6 months earlier, I'd been limiting our contact to the bare minimum. I responded to his texts when absolutely necessary, but I wasn't volunteering information about my personal life. The engagement felt too precious and new to subject to his inevitable criticism and negativity. But I knew I'd have to tell him eventually, especially since Christmas was approaching and he'd be coming home to Millfield for his annual holiday visit. My parents would certainly mention Daniel during family conversations, and I'd rather control how Marcus learned about my engagement than let him find out accidentally. I was still debating how and when to share the news when Marcus sent me another one of his characteristically harsh messages. This one was triggered by a photo my mother had posted on social media of me helping her plant some flowers in her garden. I was wearing old clothes and had dirt under my fingernails, and I looked happy and relaxed. "Saw Mom's photo," his text read. "Still playing in the dirt, I see. Some things never change. Hope you're not expecting some Prince Charming to come rescue you from your exciting life of manual labor. Real men want women with ambition and sophistication, not girls who peaked in high school." The message stung, especially the part about no one wanting to rescue me. Marcus had no idea that I'd already found someone who loved me exactly as I was, someone who saw potential and value in me that Marcus was apparently incapable of recognizing. I decided not to respond to his text. Instead, I called my mother and told her that I wanted Daniel to come to Christmas dinner this year as my fiancé. It was time for my family to meet the man I was going to marry, and it was time for Marcus to learn that his predictions about my future had been spectacularly wrong. My mother was delighted by the plan and immediately started making arrangements for a larger Christmas meal. She wanted everything to be perfect for Daniel's first official family dinner, and she peppered me with questions about his favorite foods and any dietary restrictions. I found myself getting nervous as Christmas approached, though not about Daniel meeting my parents. I knew they'd love him. What worried me was Marcus's reaction. I could predict exactly how he'd respond to learning about my engagement. He'd be skeptical, condescending, and probably rude to Daniel. He'd look for ways to undermine my happiness or suggest that I was settling for someone beneath me. What Marcus wouldn't be expecting was Daniel himself. He'd probably assumed that anyone willing to date me would be someone he could easily intimidate or dismiss. He had no idea that Daniel is not only successful and accomplished, but also confident enough to handle whatever social games Marcus might try to play. The stage was set for a Christmas dinner that would finally show Marcus just how wrong he'd been about my life, my worth, and my future. I just had to hope that when the truth came out, it would be as satisfying as I'd been imagining it would be. Christmas Eve arrived with a fresh layer of snow covering Millfield, making everything look pristine and peaceful. I spent the morning at Daniel's house, helping him wrap the gifts he'd bought for my parents. He'd been thoughtful about his choices: a beautiful cashmere scarf for my mother and a vintage woodworking book for my father, who had always enjoyed making furniture in his spare time.
"Are you nervous?" I asked, watching Daniel fold the wrapping paper with precise corners. "A little," he admitted. "I want them to like me, obviously, but I'm more concerned about your brother. You've mentioned that he can be challenging." I'd given Daniel a basic overview of Marcus's personality and our strained relationship, though I'd tried to downplay just how cruel my brother could be. I didn't want Daniel to feel like he was walking into a hostile situation, but I also wanted him to be prepared for Marcus's tendency to test people he perceived as threats to his position in the family hierarchy. "Marcus likes to establish dominance," I explained. "He'll probably ask you a lot of questions about your work and try to find ways to make himself seem more successful or important. Just don't take it personally. It's not really about you. It's about him needing to feel superior." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "I can handle that. I've dealt with plenty of people like that in business settings. The key is usually just not to engage with the competitive behavior directly." That evening, we drove to my parents' house together.
Daniel had offered to pick me up, but I'd suggested we meet at his place first so I could see how he was feeling about the evening ahead. He seemed calm and confident, which helped settle my own nerves. My parents' house looked warm and inviting with Christmas lights strung along the roofline and wreaths on the front door. My mother had clearly spent extra time making everything perfect for this first official meeting with Daniel. Through the front windows, I could see the dining room table set with her good china and the Christmas tree twinkling in the corner of the living room. "It looks lovely," Daniel said as we walked up the front steps. "Very welcoming." My father answered the door, greeting Daniel with a firm handshake and genuine warmth. My parents had met Daniel briefly once before, but this was their first real opportunity to get to know him as my fiancé. My mother appeared moments later, practically glowing with excitement as she hugged both of us. "Daniel, we're so happy to have you here," she said. "Katie has told us wonderful things about you." Marcus's car wasn't in the driveway yet, which meant we'd have some time to settle in before the evening's main challenge arrived. I was grateful for this buffer period. It would give my parents a chance to talk with Daniel without Marcus's disruptive presence. We gathered in the living room, where my father had already started a fire in the fireplace. Daniel seemed genuinely interested in the family photos on the mantelpiece, asking questions about various relatives and family traditions. He complimented my mother on the decorations and the delicious smells coming from the kitchen. "Katie mentioned that you work in investment management," my father said. "That must be interesting work. Do you enjoy it?" "I do," replied. "I like the analytical aspects of it, and I enjoy helping businesses grow and succeed. There's something satisfying about identifying potential in a company or project that others might have overlooked." My mother wanted to know how we'd met, so I told the story of Daniel's first visit to Henderson's Hardware when he'd needed supplies for his renovation project. My parents seemed charmed by the idea that we'd connected over practical problem solving and had built our relationship through those regular conversations at the store. "It sounds like you two have a lot in common," my mother observed. "You both seem to enjoy helping people find solutions to their challenges." Daniel smiled at this observation. "That's exactly what drew me to Katie initially. She has this remarkable ability to really listen to what people need and then figure out how to help them. It's a rare skill." The conversation was flowing naturally when we heard Marcus's BMW pull into the driveway. I felt my shoulders tense automatically, and Daniel must have noticed because he reached over and gave my hand a reassuring squeeze. "Showtime," I murmured under my breath. Marcus came through the front door with his usual theatrical energy, carrying expensive-looking gift bags and wearing what was clearly a designer coat. He greeted our parents with elaborate hugs and immediately launched into updates about his latest business successes and the exclusive Christmas party his company had hosted the week before. "You should have seen this venue," he was saying as he hung up his coat. "They rented out the entire top floor of the Westin, with catering from that new place that's impossible to get reservations at. The company spared no expense." It was classic Marcus behavior, establishing his high-status lifestyle before even acknowledging that there were other people in the room. When he finally turned toward the living room and saw Daniel sitting next to me on the couch, his expression shifted to one of curiosity mixed with skepticism. "And who might this be?" Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected he knew the answer. "Marcus, this is Daniel Richardson. I've stood up. My fiancé. Daniel, this is my brother Marcus." The word fiancé hung in the air for a moment while Marcus processed this information. I watched his face cycle through surprise, confusion, and then something that looked almost like panic. He recovered quickly, though, extending his hand to Daniel with a smile that didn't reach his eyes.
"Fiancé?" Marcus said, shaking Daniel's hand. "Well, this is unexpected news. Katie's been keeping secrets, apparently." Daniel stood to meet Marcus's handshake, and I noticed that he was several inches taller than my brother, which seemed to catch Marcus off guard. Daniel was also impeccably dressed in a way that managed to look both expensive and understated, exactly the kind of effortless sophistication that Marcus always tried to project but never quite achieved. "Nice to meet you, Marcus," Daniel said warmly. "Katie's told me a lot about you. Congratulations on your success with the pharmaceutical company. That sounds like challenging work." This response seemed to throw Marcus off balance. He'd clearly been prepared to interrogate Daniel or establish his own superiority, but Daniel had preemptively acknowledged Marcus's achievements in a way that was gracious without being deferential. "Yes, well, it is demanding," Marcus said, still trying to regain his footing. "Lots of travel, high-pressure negotiations, million-dollar deals. Not everyone can handle that kind of responsibility." "I'm sure," Daniel agreed. "The pharmaceutical industry is incredibly competitive. It takes real skill to succeed in that environment." I could see Marcus becoming increasingly frustrated with Daniel's responses. Every time Marcus tried to set up a competitive dynamic, Daniel simply acknowledged his accomplishments and moved on. It was like watching someone try to start an argument with someone who refused to participate. "So, Daniel," Marcus said, settling into his favorite interrogation mode, "what is it that you do for work? Katie mentioned something about business, but she was pretty vague about the details." "I work in private equity and investment management," Daniel replied. "I help clients identify strategic investment opportunities and manage diversified portfolios." Marcus's eyes lit up at this response. Finance was territory he felt comfortable attacking, since his sales role at the pharmaceutical company involved some financial negotiations. "Private equity," Marcus repeated. "That's a pretty broad field. Are we talking about small-time local investments, or do you work with institutional clients?" I recognized the trap Marcus was setting. He was trying to get Daniel to reveal that he worked at a small local firm that Marcus could then dismiss as unimpressive compared to his own corporate position. "I work with a mix of high-net-worth individuals and institutional investors, family offices, pension funds, university endowments, clients who are looking for consistent returns across different market conditions." This answer clearly wasn't what Marcus had been hoping for. Terms like family offices and university endowments suggested a level of sophistication that was hard to dismiss, but Marcus wasn't ready to give up. "Interesting," he said. "And what kind of assets under management are we talking about? I mean, in my industry, we're used to dealing with pretty substantial numbers." I wanted to intervene at this point. Marcus was being embarrassingly aggressive in his attempts to establish financial superiority, and I could see my parents looking uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. But Daniel seemed completely unfazed. "I prefer not to discuss specific numbers," Daniel said, with a slight smile. "Client confidentiality, you understand. But I've been fortunate to work with some wonderful people and organizations over the years." This non-answer was masterful. Daniel had declined to engage in Marcus's pissing contest while simultaneously suggesting that his client relationships were substantial enough to require discretion. It was exactly the kind of response that someone who actually dealt with serious money would give, and Marcus seemed to recognize this. Of course," Marcus said. "Confidentiality is important in finance." My mother chose this moment to announce that dinner was ready, which broke the tension and gave everyone an excuse to move to the dining room. As we settled around the table, I found myself sitting between Daniel and my father, with Marcus directly across from me. The seating arrangement put Marcus in a position where he could continue his interrogation throughout the meal. The conversation during dinner ranged across various topics, but Marcus kept steering it back to questions about Daniel's background and work. He asked about Daniel's education, his previous jobs, where he'd grown up, and what had brought him to Millfield. Daniel answered everything politely and thoroughly, but I could tell that Marcus was becoming increasingly frustrated with his inability to find any obvious weaknesses.
"So what brought you to our little town?" Marcus asked as we worked through my mother's famous glazed ham. "Millfield isn't exactly a hub for financial services. Seems like an unusual place for someone in your industry to end up." "I was looking for somewhere quiet, where I could focus on my work without the distractions of a major city," Daniel explained. "I do most of my business remotely anyway, and I've always preferred smaller communities. Millfield has been perfect for what I need." But don't you miss the energy of a big city? Marcus pressed. I mean, Chicago has so much to offer. Cultural events, networking opportunities, high-end restaurants. When I moved there, I couldn't believe how much I'd been missing living in a place like this. I could see what Marcus was doing. He was trying to suggest that anyone with real ambition and sophistication would naturally gravitate toward a major city like Chicago, implying that Daniel's choice to live in Millfield indicated some kind of limitation or lack of ambition. Different people thrive in different environments, Daniel said diplomatically. I spent plenty of time in major cities earlier in my career. New York, Boston, San Francisco. They all have their advantages, but at this stage of my life, I value peace and privacy more than convenience and networking opportunities. The phrase, "this stage of my life," seemed to intrigue Marcus. How old are you, if you don't mind me asking? 32, Daniel replied. Marcus looked surprised. 32? You seem pretty established for someone that young. Most people I know in finance are still grinding it out at that age, trying to make partners or build their client base. This observation contained both a compliment and a veiled accusation. Marcus was acknowledging that Daniel seemed successful, but he was also implying that this level of success was suspicious in someone so young. I've been fortunate, Daniel said simply. I had some good mentors early in my career, and I was in the right place at the right time for a few key opportunities. Throughout this entire exchange, I was growing increasingly proud of how Daniel was handling Marcus's interrogation. He never became defensive or aggressive, but he also never allowed Marcus to diminish his achievements or make him feel like he had to prove himself. It was a masterclass in confident, gracious behavior under pressure. But I could tell that Marcus was becoming desperate. All of his usual tactics for establishing dominance and making other people feel small were failing completely. Daniel was too confident, too accomplished, and too composed to be rattled by Marcus's games. As we finished dinner and my mother brought out her homemade apple pie, Marcus made one final attempt to assert his superiority. Well, Daniel, it sounds like you've done well for yourself, he said, in a tone that managed to sound both congratulatory and condescending. I'm sure Katie appreciates having found someone who can provide for her. God knows she's never shown much interest in providing for herself. The comment was so cruel and unnecessary that it left everyone at the table speechless for a moment. My father's fork paused halfway to his mouth, my mother's smile faltered, and I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. But before I could respond, Daniel set down his fork and looked directly at Marcus with an expression I'd never seen before. The warmth and politeness were still there, but underneath was something much steelier. Actually, Marcus, Daniel said quietly, Katie is one of the most capable and self-sufficient people I've ever met. She's built a reputation in this community as someone who can solve problems and help people. She's financially independent, and she's managed to maintain her integrity and kindness despite facing some pretty challenging family dynamics. I consider myself incredibly lucky that she's willing to marry me. The words were delivered with such calm authority that they seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Marcus's face went through several color changes as he realized that his attempt to belittle me had not only failed, but had actually resulted in his own humiliation. My mother recovered first, beaming at Daniel with obvious approval. That's exactly how we feel about our Katie, she said firmly. She's always been remarkable. My father nodded agreement, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. No one had ever defended me like that, especially not in front of Marcus. Daniel had managed to completely turn the tables on my brother without raising his voice or saying anything unkind about him directly. Marcus seemed to realize that he'd lost this particular battle, and he spent the rest of the evening in uncharacteristic silence. But I could tell from the expression on his face that he wasn't ready to accept defeat. He was already planning his next move. After dinner, we moved back to the living room for coffee and the gift exchange. The atmosphere had shifted considerably from the earlier tension. My parents were clearly smitten with Daniel, asking him about his interests outside of work and sharing stories about our family traditions. Marcus sat quietly in the corner armchair, nursing his coffee and watching Daniel with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle.
Daniel had brought thoughtful gifts for everyone, including a beautiful leather portfolio for Marcus that was clearly expensive and perfectly suited to his professional image. The gesture was gracious, especially considering how Marcus had behaved during dinner, and it seemed to catch my brother off guard.
"This is really nice," Marcus said, examining the portfolio's craftsmanship. "Thank you." For a moment, I thought maybe Marcus would let his guard down and try to salvage the evening. But as my parents excused themselves to the kitchen to start cleaning up, he leaned forward in his chair with renewed focus. "Daniel, can I ask you something?" Marcus said, in a tone that immediately put me on alert. "Of course," Daniel replied, though I noticed his posture become slightly more guarded. "That house of yours that Katie mentioned, where exactly is it located? I might know some people in the area." This seemed like an innocent enough question, but I knew Marcus well enough to recognize that he was fishing for information he could use somehow. Daniel provided general directions to his neighborhood, describing it as being about 15 minutes outside town near Miller's Creek. Marcus's eyes lit up with recognition. "Wait, Miller's Creek Road? That's where the Blackstone Estate development is. Those houses start at what, 2 million? Maybe more." I felt my stomach drop. Marcus had somehow stumbled onto information that Daniel had been keeping deliberately vague. The fact that Daniel's house was in an ultra-expensive development was not something he'd advertised, and I could see him weighing how to respond. "The neighborhood is quite nice," Daniel said carefully. "I wanted something private and peaceful." But Marcus was like a dog with a bone now. "Those aren't just nice houses, Daniel. Those are some of the most expensive properties in the entire county. I looked at real estate listings there once, just out of curiosity. We're talking about serious money." Daniel remained calm, but I could see the calculation behind his eyes. He'd been trying to keep his wealth relatively low-key, probably not wanting to overwhelm my family or make them feel uncomfortable. But Marcus had just made that impossible. "I've been fortunate in my investments," Daniel said simply. "Fortunate?" Marcus pressed. "Daniel, if you live in Blackstone Estates, we're not talking about being fortunate. We're talking about serious wealth. What exactly do you do, really?" The question hung in the air, and I could feel the entire dynamic of the evening shifting. My parents had returned from the kitchen and were standing in the doorway, sensing the tension but not understanding its source. Daniel looked at me, and I could see him making a decision. He'd been trying to protect me from having to deal with the complications that came with his wealth, but Marcus had forced his hand. "All right," Daniel said, setting down his coffee cup. "Since you're so curious, Marcus, I'll be more specific. I founded and run Richardson Capital Management. We're a private equity firm that specializes in mid-market acquisitions and growth investments. We manage approximately $3 billion in assets across various sectors." The number hit the room like a physical blow. $3 billion. My parents looked stunned, and Marcus's face went completely pale. $3 billion, Marcus repeated in a whisper. "Give or take," Daniel said matter-of-factly. "The exact number fluctuates with market conditions, of course." I felt like I couldn't breathe. I'd known Daniel was wealthy, obviously. His house, his clothes, his lifestyle, none of that came cheap. But $3 billion was a number so large I could barely comprehend it. Marcus looked like he might be sick. "You run a $3 billion investment firm?" "I founded it 8 years ago with initial capital from my family and some early investors. We started small, but we've grown considerably as we've built our track record and reputation." "Your family?" Marcus said weakly. "What kind of family has that kind of initial capital?" Daniel seemed to realize there was no point in holding back anymore. "My grandfather founded Richardson Industries in the 1940s. My father expanded it significantly. When I decided to go into finance instead of joining the family business, they provided the seed capital for my firm." Richardson Industries. Even I had heard of Richardson Industries. They were a massive conglomerate involved in everything from manufacturing to real estate to technology investments. If Daniel was from that Richardson family, then $3 billion was probably just the beginning. "You're from the Richardson family?" my mother asked, her voice barely above a whisper.
As in Richardson Industries? Yes, Daniel said simply, though I've tried to make my own way rather than just inheriting a position in the family business. That's why I started my own firm. Marcus stood up abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the snowy yard. When he turned back around, his entire demeanor had changed. The arrogance and condescension were gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine fear. "Katie," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "can I talk to you privately for a minute?" Before I could respond, Daniel stood up as well. "Actually, Marcus, if you have something to say about my relationship with Katie, I'd prefer you say it in front of everyone. We're going to be family after all." The words were polite, but there was steel underneath them. Daniel had clearly had enough of Marcus's games. Marcus looked around the room, taking in my parents' shocked faces, Daniel's calm confidence, and my own mixture of confusion and growing anger. He seemed to realize that whatever he said next would determine how this entire situation played out. "I think I owe everyone an apology," he said finally, "especially Katie." This was not what I'd been expecting. Marcus never apologized for anything.
Marcus paused, struggling to find words. "I've been unfair to Katie. More than unfair. I've been cruel and condescending, and I convinced myself it was because I wanted her to have higher standards for herself. But that wasn't really it." He looked directly at me, and for the first time in years, I saw something vulnerable in his expression. "The truth is, I was threatened by you," he continued. "You stayed here in Millfield, you seemed happy with your simple life, and it made me question whether all my ambition and status chasing was actually worth anything. So I tried to tear you down, to make myself feel better about my choices." Daniel remained standing, watching this confession with interest but no apparent sympathy. "And now," Marcus said, his voice getting smaller, "I find out that while I was criticizing you for working at a hardware store, you somehow managed to attract and fall in love with someone who's worth more money than I'll ever see in my lifetime. Someone who clearly thinks you're perfect exactly as you are." The silence stretched out as everyone processed this admission. My father cleared his throat uncomfortably, while my mother looked like she wasn't sure whether to comfort Marcus or lecture him. "Marcus," Daniel said quietly, "Katie doesn't need to be with me to validate her worth. She's remarkable on her own merit. The fact that you couldn't see that says more about you than it does about her." "I know," Marcus said, looking miserable. "I know that now. Katie, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for all the horrible things I said to you. You deserved better from me, especially as your brother." I stared at Marcus, trying to process this complete reversal from the person who had spent years telling me I was a failure and would die alone and poor. Part of me wanted to accept his apology and move forward, but another part of me was furious that it had taken Daniel's wealth to make him realize how badly he'd been treating me. "So you're only apologizing now because you found out Daniel has money?" I asked. "If he'd been a regular guy who worked construction or taught school, you would have kept treating me like garbage?" Marcus flinched at the directness of my question. I don't know. Maybe. And that's horrible, isn't it? That it took something like this to make me realize what I'd become?" "Yes," I said simply. "It is horrible." The room fell silent again. My parents looked uncomfortable with the whole confrontation, but I could see that they were finally understanding the full extent of how Marcus had been treating me over the years. Daniel sat back down next to me and took my hand. "Katie, whatever you decide about your relationship with Marcus going forward, I'll support. But I want you to know that his opinion of you never mattered to me, and it shouldn't matter to you either." "It did matter to me, though," I said, looking at Marcus. "You're my brother. I wanted your respect and support, and instead, you spent years trying to convince me I was worthless." Marcus nodded, tears starting to form in his eyes. "I know, and I don't know how to fix that. I don't know if I can fix that. Maybe you can start by figuring out why you felt like you needed to tear me down to feel good about yourself. Because whatever problems you have with your own life, taking them out on me was never okay." The conversation continued for another hour, with Marcus attempting to explain his behavior and my parents trying to process both Daniel's revelation about his wealth and the years of family dysfunction they'd apparently missed. By the time Marcus finally left to drive back to his hotel, the entire family dynamic had shifted in ways that would take months to fully understand. After my parents went to bed, Daniel and I sat together on the couch, both emotionally exhausted from the evening's revelations. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you about the full extent of my family's wealth," Daniel said. "I wanted you to get to know me as a person before money became a factor." "I understand why you did that," I replied. "But $3 billion, Daniel? That's not just wealthy. That's a completely different universe from anything I've ever known." "It doesn't have to change anything between us," he said. "Money is just a tool. It doesn't define who we are or what our relationship means." I wanted to believe that, but I was also realistic enough to know that this level of wealth would change everything, whether we wanted to or not. The question was whether we could navigate those changes together while keeping what we'd originally found in each other. What I did know was that watching Daniel handle Marcus with such grace and strength had made me fall in love with him even more deeply. He'd defended me without making me feel weak, and he'd refused to let my brother's toxic behavior continue unchallenged. For the first time in years, I felt truly protected and valued by someone who saw my worth regardless of what anyone else thought. And that was worth more than all the money in the world. The week between Christmas and New Year's was unlike any other in my life. Word had somehow gotten around Millfield about Daniel's true identity, and suddenly everyone wanted to talk to me. Mrs. Henderson at the hardware store kept making comments about how I'd won the lottery, and customers who had barely acknowledged me before were suddenly treating me like I was some kind of celebrity. I hated every minute of it. The attention made me realize how much I valued the simple, genuine relationship Daniel and I had built before his wealth became public knowledge. Now I found myself wondering if people were being nice to me because they hoped to get closer to Daniel's money, or if they were judging me as a gold digger who had somehow manipulated a billionaire into falling for her. Daniel, meanwhile, was dealing with his own complications. His phone had been ringing constantly with calls from business associates, family members, and even reporters who had gotten wind of his engagement to a local hardware store clerk. The story had apparently struck some people as either romantic or suspicious, depending on their perspective. "I should have anticipated this," Daniel said, as we sat in his living room on December 28th, watching the snow fall outside. "I've worked so hard to keep my private life separate from my business persona, but I forgot how quickly things can spiral in a small town." I was curled up next to him on the couch, trying to process everything that had changed in just a few days. "Do you regret telling everyone the truth?"
Not for a second, he said firmly. Your brother needed to understand exactly how wrong he was about you and your worth. I just wish we could have controlled the timing and the context better. Marcus had been calling me every day since Christmas, leaving voicemails that ranged from tearful apologies to desperate requests for forgiveness. He'd also started texting me articles about Richardson Capital Management and Daniel's family, as if he was trying to fully grasp the magnitude of what he'd missed. I hadn't been responding to his messages, but I'd been reading them. The most recent one had been particularly pathetic. "Katie, I understand if you never want to speak to me again, but I need you to know that I'm in therapy now. I'm trying to figure out why I became such a terrible person to the one family member who never did anything wrong to me." "He's in therapy?" Daniel asked when I showed him the message. "Apparently, though knowing Marcus, it could just be another manipulation tactic." "Maybe," Daniel agreed. "But people can change, Katie. It's rare, but it happens. The question is whether you want to give him the opportunity to prove he's serious." This was one of the things I loved most about Daniel. He never tried to tell me what to do about complicated family situations, but he helped me think through my options objectively. "I'm not ready yet," I admitted. "Maybe someday, but not now. The wounds are too fresh, and I need to process everything that's happened." Daniel nodded, understanding. "Take all the time you need. There's no rush." The bigger question looming over us was what our future would look like now that the truth about Daniel's wealth was public knowledge.
He'd already started getting pressure from his family to bring me to Connecticut to meet them properly, and his business partners were curious about when we planned to have a formal wedding announcement. I feel like I'm being pulled into a world I don't understand, I told Daniel honestly. Yesterday, your assistant called to ask if I wanted to hire a personal stylist for upcoming events. I don't even know what that means. Daniel laughed, though not unkindly. Sarah can be overzealous sometimes. She's used to managing social obligations for people who live very public lives. But you don't have to change anything about yourself, Katie. If you want help navigating certain situations, we can arrange that. But you're perfect exactly as you are. But what about your family, your business associates? Won't they expect me to fit into their world somehow? This question has been keeping me awake at night. I'd looked up Daniel's family online and seen photos of charity galas and society events where everyone looked like they'd stepped out of a magazine. How was I supposed to fit into that environment? My family will love you because I love you, Daniel said confidently. And anyone in my business world who has a problem with you wasn't worth knowing anyway. I didn't build my company to impress shallow people. I built it because I'm good at what I do. The people who matter will recognize your value immediately. I wanted to believe him, but I was also practical enough to know that entering Daniel's world would require some adjustments on my part. I couldn't show up to important business dinners wearing the same clothes I wore to work at Henderson's Hardware. What if we compromise? I suggested. I'll accept help with things like formal events and meeting your family, but I want to stay true to who I am fundamentally. I don't want to become someone completely different just because I'm marrying you. That sounds perfect, Daniel agreed. Though I have to admit, I'm curious to see what you think of my family. They're interesting people. Before I could ask what that meant, Daniel's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "It's my mother," he said. "I should probably take this." I listened to Daniel's side of the conversation, trying to piece together what was happening. Apparently, word of our engagement had reached his family through business channels, and they were not pleased to have learned about it secondhand. "Yes, Mother, I understand you're disappointed, but Katie and I wanted to keep things quiet until we were ready to make formal announcements. No, she's not some opportunistic gold digger. Yes, I'm sure. Well, you'll just have to trust my judgment until you meet her." The conversation went on for another 10 minutes, with Daniel becoming increasingly firm in his responses. When he finally hung up, he looked exhausted. "That bad?" I asked. "My mother is protective," Daniel said diplomatically. "She's worried that someone might be taking advantage of me. It's happened before in our family, people who were more interested in our money than in us as individuals." I felt a chill run down my spine. Does she think I'm taking advantage of you? "She doesn't know you yet," Daniel said. "Once she meets you and sees how we interact, she'll understand that our relationship is genuine. But in the meantime, she's going to be suspicious and probably a bit cold." "How cold are we talking?" Daniel winced slightly. "She might hire a private investigator to look into your background. She's done it before with people I've dated." The idea of being investigated like a potential criminal was terrifying. What will they find? "Nothing concerning," Daniel said reassuringly. "You're exactly who you appear to be, Katie. That's one of the things I love most about you. But it might feel invasive to have strangers digging into your life." Over the next few days, the reality of what Daniel had warned me about became apparent. I started noticing unfamiliar people asking questions about me around town. At the grocery store, at the post office, even at Henderson's Hardware. They were subtle about it, but it was clear that someone was conducting a thorough background investigation. The attention made me uncomfortable, but it also made me angry. I hadn't done anything wrong, yet I was being treated like a suspect in some kind of crime. The crime, apparently, was falling in love with someone wealthy. "This is what your life is like?" I asked Daniel one evening, after a particularly awkward encounter with someone who claimed to be a freelance journalist, but was obviously gathering information for someone else. "Not usually," Daniel admitted. "My family is being more thorough than usual because they're concerned about the situation. But yes, this level of scrutiny is part of what comes with significant wealth. People are always wondering about your motivations and relationships."
I was beginning to understand why Daniel had been so careful about revealing his true financial situation. Money at this level didn't just buy you things, it bought you problems, complications, and a complete lack of privacy. But despite all the external pressures and investigations, my feelings for Daniel remained unchanged. If anything, watching him handle these family pressures while still protecting and supporting me made me love him even more. He never once suggested that I should change to appease his family or that their approval mattered more than our relationship. The real test came on New Year's Eve, when Daniel's parents announced they were flying to Millfield to meet me in person. No discussion, no negotiation. They were coming, and they expected to have dinner with us on January 1st. "They're not going to intimidate me into breaking up with you," I told Daniel as we prepared for what felt like the most important dinner of my life. "Good," Daniel said, kissing my forehead, "because I'm not going anywhere, no matter what they say or do." As we got ready to face his family's judgment, I couldn't help but think about how different this situation was from Marcus's cruel predictions about my future. My brother had been convinced that no successful man would ever want someone like me. Yet here I was, preparing to fight for a relationship with someone whose family was concerned I might not be good enough for him. The irony wasn't lost on me, but more importantly, I finally understood my own worth in a way that had nothing to do with other people's opinions or bank account balances. Daniel loved me for who I was, and that was enough. Everything else was just noise we'd have to navigate together. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether our love could survive the full force of his family's wealth and expectations. But for the first time since this whole situation began, I felt ready for whatever came next. Daniel's parents arrived in Millfield on New Year's Day in a private jet that landed at the small regional airport 20 miles outside town. The very fact that they traveled this way told me everything I needed to know about the level of wealth and power I was dealing with. This wasn't just rich, this was a completely different stratosphere of society. I spent the morning getting ready with an attention to detail I'd never bothered with before. Daniel had arranged for a stylist to help me choose an outfit that would be appropriate for meeting his parents, and I'd reluctantly agreed. The woman who came to his house was kind and professional, helping me select a dress that was elegant but not trying too hard, sophisticated enough to show respect, but still unmistakably me. "You look perfect," Daniel said, as I emerged from his bedroom in a navy blue dress that somehow managed to make me feel both confident and comfortable. "My parents are going to love you," he said. I could hear the slight uncertainty in his voice, though, and I knew he was probably more nervous about this meeting than I was. He'd spent the past week fielding increasingly anxious phone calls from his mother, who seemed convinced that I was either a con artist or completely inappropriate for their family. "What's the worst that could happen?" I asked, trying to lighten the move. "They could threaten to disinherit me," Daniel said, then immediately looked like he regretted being so honest. "But that won't happen, and even if it did, it wouldn't matter. I built my own company, Katie. I don't need their money." The fact that he'd even mentioned disinheritance told me how seriously his family was taking their disapproval of our relationship. I was about to meet people who thought I was such a threat to their son that they were willing to fly across the country on New Year's Day to confront me in person. The irony wasn't lost on me, but more importantly, I finally understood my own worth in a way that had nothing to do with other people's opinions or bank account balances. Daniel loved me for who I was, and that was enough. Everything else was just noise we'd have to navigate together. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether our love could survive the full force of his family's wealth and expectations. But for the first time since this whole situation began, I felt ready for whatever came next. Daniel's parents arrived in Millfield on New Year's Day in a private jet that landed at the small regional airport 20 miles outside town. The very fact that they traveled this way told me everything I needed to know about the level of wealth and power I was dealing with. This wasn't just rich, this was a completely different stratosphere of society. I spent the morning getting ready with an attention to detail I'd never bothered with before. Daniel had arranged for a stylist to help me choose an outfit that would be appropriate for meeting his parents, and I'd reluctantly agreed. The woman who came to his house was kind and professional, helping me select a dress that was elegant but not trying too hard, sophisticated enough to show respect, but still unmistakably me.
"You look perfect," Daniel said, as I emerged from his bedroom in a navy blue dress that somehow managed to make me feel both confident and comfortable. I could hear the slight uncertainty in his voice, though, and I knew he was probably more nervous about this meeting than I was. He'd spent the past week fielding increasingly anxious phone calls from his mother, who seemed convinced that I was either a con artist or completely inappropriate for their family. "What's the worst that could happen?" I asked, trying to lighten the mood. "They could threaten to disinherit me," Daniel said, then immediately looked like he regretted being so honest. "But that won't happen, and even if it did, it wouldn't matter. I built my own company, Katie. I don't need their money." The fact that he'd even mentioned disinheritance told me how seriously his family was taking their disapproval of our relationship. I was about to meet people who thought I was such a threat to their son that they were willing to fly across the country on New Year's Day to confront me in person. We drove to Romano's, the same restaurant where Daniel and I had our first date. He'd chosen it deliberately, wanting his parents to see him in the environment where our relationship had flourished. A simple, authentic place that represented the life we'd built together in Millfield. When we walked into the restaurant, I immediately spotted Daniel's parents at a corner table. They were exactly what I'd expected based on the photos I'd seen online. Impeccably dressed, radiating an aura of wealth and authority that made everyone else in the restaurant look slightly shabby by comparison. Victoria Richardson was a striking woman in her late 50s with perfectly styled silver hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in every detail of her surroundings. She wore what was obviously an expensive suit and jewelry that probably cost more than I made in a year. William Richardson was tall like Daniel, with the same confident bearing, but his expression was considerably colder than his son's had ever been.
Mother, father, Daniel said as we approached the table, I'd like you to meet Katie Pemberton. Katie, these are my parents, Victoria and William Richardson. Victoria's handshake was firm but brief, and her smile never reached her eyes. William was even less warm, giving me the kind of handshake that conveyed polite obligation rather than any genuine pleasure at meeting me. Miss Pemberton, Victoria said as we all sat down, we've heard so much about you. The way she said it made it clear that what she'd heard hadn't impressed her. I could feel myself being evaluated and measured against some standard that I probably couldn't meet no matter what I did. It's wonderful to meet you both, I replied. Daniel has told me how close your family is. Yes, we are, William said curtly, which is why we were surprised to learn about your engagement through business associates rather than from Daniel directly. Daniel shifted uncomfortably next to me. I wanted Katie to be comfortable with the idea of meeting you before we made any formal announcements. Comfortable, Victoria repeated, as if the word had an unpleasant taste. I see. And are you comfortable now, Miss Pemberton? The question was clearly a trap, but I wasn't sure what kind. If I said yes, it might sound presumptuous. If I said no, it might suggest that I wasn't serious about the relationship. I'm nervous, I said honestly, but yes, I'm comfortable with Daniel and our relationship. Meeting you is important to me because you're important to him. Victoria exchanged a look with her husband that I couldn't interpret. The waiter came by to take our drink orders, providing a brief reprieve from the interrogation, but I could feel both parents studying me during the pause. Tell us about yourself, Miss Pemberton, William said once the waiter had left. What are your career aspirations? I'd been expecting this question, but it still made me nervous. How do you explain to people who run billion-dollar enterprises that you're happy working at a hardware store? Right now, I work at Henderson's Hardware, here in town. I really enjoy helping customers solve their problems and find the right products for their needs. Long-term, I'm interested in maybe pursuing more education in business management, possibly with the goal of starting my own company someday. What kind of company? Victoria asked, her tone suggesting that she expected the answer to be something frivolous. I'm not sure yet, I admitted. Maybe something in the service industry, helping people with home improvement projects, or possibly something that connects local businesses with customers who need specialized services. I could see both parents processing this answer, and I had the distinct impression that they found my ambitions disappointingly small-scale. And your family? William asked. What do your parents do? This was another landmine.
My parents were wonderful people, but they were definitely not in the same social or economic class as the Richardsons. My father works as a supervisor at the county maintenance department, I said. He's been there for almost 30 years. My mother is a part-time bookkeeper for several small businesses in town. They're both retired from their previous careers and are very active in our community. The silence that followed this explanation was deafening. I could practically see Victoria and William calculating how inappropriate they found my family background. "How interesting," Victoria said, in a tone that suggested it was anything but. "And your brother? Daniel mentioned you had a brother." I felt my cheeks flush. Marcus had been such a disaster at Christmas that I'd hoped Daniel hadn't shared those details with his parents. "My brother works in pharmaceutical sales in Chicago," I said carefully. "He's done very well for himself." "But you chose to stay in Millfield, working in retail." The way he said retail made it sound like I was selling drugs or something equally disreputable. "I like Millfield," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's a good community with good people. Not everyone defines success the same way." This comment seemed to hit a nerve with Victoria. "And how do you define success, Miss Pemberton?" "Being able to support myself, being useful to my community, maintaining good relationships with people I care about, finding work that feels meaningful, even if it's not glamorous." "How admirable," Victoria said, in a way that made it clear she found my definition of success utterly inadequate. Daniel had been sitting quietly through this exchange, but I could see his jaw tightening with every condescending comment his parents made. "Actually," he said finally, "Katie's approach to life is one of the things I admire most about her. She's built genuine relationships with people throughout this community. She's respected for her integrity and her willingness to help others. Those are qualities that can't be bought or inherited." The last part was clearly directed at his parents, and William's expression darkened considerably. "Daniel," William said in a warning tone, "we're simply trying to understand your choice." "My choice?" Daniel's voice was getting sharper. "You mean my choice to fall in love with someone who makes me happy?" "We mean your choice to get engaged to someone whose background and aspirations are so different from what we'd hoped for you."
The mask of politeness was finally slipping, and I could see the real concern underneath. They weren't just worried that I was a gold digger, they were worried that I was beneath their family socially and would somehow diminish their status. "Different how?" I asked, surprising myself with how calm my voice sounded. "Different because I work with my hands? Different because my parents aren't wealthy? Different because I didn't go to an Ivy League school?" Victoria's eyes flashed with anger at my directness. "Miss Pemberton, I think you're misunderstanding our concerns." "No, I don't think I am," I replied. "I think you're concerned that your son is marrying someone you consider inferior. And I think you're hoping that if you make that clear enough, either he'll change his mind or I'll walk away to save him the embarrassment." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Daniel reached for my hand under the table, squeezing it in support. "Katie," he said quietly, "you don't have to defend yourself to anyone." "Actually, I do," I said, looking directly at his parents. "Because if I'm going to marry your son, we need to understand each other. Mr. and Mrs. Richardson, I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not to win your approval. I love Daniel, and he loves me. We make each other happy, we share the same values, and we want to build a life together. If that's not enough for you, then we have a problem." Victoria looked like she might actually have been shocked into speechlessness, while William's expression had shifted from condescension to something approaching respect. "And if we don't approve," William asked, "then you'll miss out on getting to know someone who would have loved you as family," I said simply. "But you won't change Daniel's mind, and you certainly won't change mine." For the first time since we'd sat down, Victoria smiled. A real smile, not the polite mask she'd been wearing. "Well," she said, "at least she has backbone." The comment caught me completely off guard, and I wasn't sure if it was a compliment or an insult. But something in the atmosphere had shifted, and I could see Daniel relaxing slightly beside me. The rest of the dinner was still somewhat strained, but the open hostility had dissipated. Victoria and William asked more questions about my life and my relationship with Daniel, but their tone was more curious than antagonistic. They were still clearly not thrilled about the situation, but they seemed to have accepted that their disapproval wasn't going to change anything. As we prepared to leave the restaurant, Victoria pulled me aside while Daniel and his father were settling the check. "Miss Pemberton," she said quietly, "I want you to understand something. Our wealth has made Daniel a target his entire life. People have tried to use him, manipulate him, and take advantage of him in ways you probably can't imagine. Our concern isn't about your social status, it's about protecting our son from being hurt." I looked at her carefully, trying to read the sincerity in her expression. "Mrs. Richardson, I would never hurt Daniel. I love him exactly as he is, not for what he has." "I hope that's true," she said, "because if you ever do hurt him, you'll discover that we can be very protective parents." It wasn't exactly a threat, but it wasn't far from one either. As we walked out to our cars, I realized that winning over Daniel's parents was going to be a much longer process than one dinner could accomplish. But at least we'd established that I wasn't going to be intimidated into disappearing, and they weren't going to be able to simply dismiss me as unworthy of their son. The real test of our relationship was just beginning. The weeks following the dinner with Daniel's parents brought unexpected developments. While I'd expected them to return to Connecticut and continue their campaign against our relationship from a distance, Victoria Richardson surprised me by extending our visit. She decided to stay in Millfield for another week, claiming she wanted to better understand the environment that had produced someone Daniel found so compelling. Daniel was as surprised as I was. His mother had never shown interest in small-town life, and her decision to remain suggested either genuine curiosity or a more sophisticated strategy than I'd anticipated. "She's planning something," Daniel warned me, as we prepared for what had become daily interactions with his mother. "Victoria doesn't do anything with a purpose." That purpose became clear on the third day of her extended visit. Victoria appeared at Henderson's Hardware during my afternoon shift, elegantly dressed, but clearly out of her element among the power tools and gardening supplies. "Mrs. Richardson," I said, trying to hide my surprise, "can I help you find something?" "Actually, yes," she said, examining a display of screwdrivers with the same intensity she might apply to a piece of art. "I'm curious about something you said at dinner. You mentioned that you help customers solve their problems rather than just sell them products. I'd like to see what that looks like in practice."
It was an odd request, but before I could respond, Mrs. Chen from Oak Street came through the door looking frustrated and carrying a small paper bag. "Katie, I'm so glad you're here," Mrs. Chen said. "I've been to 3 different stores trying to find the right part for my kitchen faucet, and nothing works. My husband is getting angrier by the minute, and I'm afraid I'm going to flood the whole house if I can't fix this leak." I took the bag from Mrs. Chen and examined the various washers and O-rings she'd collected during her unsuccessful shopping trips. None of them were quite right for what she needed, but I could see the problem immediately. "Mrs. Chen, you don't need a new part," I said gently. "You need to clean the mineral deposits off the old one and apply some plumber's grease. The seal is actually fine, it's just not sitting properly because of buildup." I walked her through the simple cleaning process, showed her the right type of grease to buy, and explained how to reassemble everything. The total cost was $3 instead of the $50 she'd been prepared to spend on unnecessary replacement parts. "You're a lifesaver, Katie," Mrs. Chen said, hugging me impulsively. "My husband always says you know more about fixing things than most of the professional repairmen in town." After she left, Victoria studied me with renewed interest. "That was impressive," she said. "You could have sold her expensive parts she didn't need." "Why would I do that?" I asked. She trusted me to help her, not take advantage of her. Most businesses would see an opportunity to increase their profit margin. Henderson's isn't most businesses. Mr. Henderson built this place on the principle that helping people solve their problems correctly the first time creates customers for life. It's more profitable in the long run, to be honest. Victoria nodded thoughtfully, then spent the next hour observing my interactions with various customers. I helped a teenager find the right paint for a school project, walked an elderly man through the process of winterizing his outdoor faucets, and convinced a woman that she didn't need to replace her entire garden hose when a simple coupling repair would fix her leak. "You enjoy this work," Victoria observed as the store grew quiet during the late afternoon lull. "I do," I admitted. "I know it's not glamorous, but there's something satisfying about being genuinely useful to people." "And you don't find it limiting working in such a small scope when you could be doing something more ambitious?" It was the same question Marcus had tortured me with for years, but coming from Victoria, it felt more like genuine curiosity than condescension. "I think there's honor in any work that's done well and serves a real purpose," I said. "Not everyone needs to run a multinational corporation to have a meaningful life." "That's an interesting perspective," Victoria said, "especially considering that you're about to marry someone whose life is entirely focused on large-scale ambitions." "Daniel and I complement each other," I replied. "He operates in the world of big-picture strategy and major investments. I focus on individual problems and personal relationships. Both approaches have value." Victoria spent another hour asking me detailed questions about my work, my relationship with Daniel, and my thoughts on everything from community involvement to long-term planning. It felt like the most thorough job interview of my life, except I wasn't sure what position I was applying for. The next day, Daniel told me that his mother had called him with what she described as preliminary conclusions about me and our relationship. "She's not ready to give us her blessing," Daniel explained, "but she's no longer actively opposed to the engagement. She said you demonstrated something she called practical intelligence and genuine character." "That sounds like faint praise," I said. "From my mother, it's practically a ringing endorsement. Victoria doesn't give compliments easily, especially to people she initially disapproved of." The real breakthrough came during Victoria's final day in Millfield, when an ice storm knocked out power to most of the town. Daniel's house had a generator, but many of the older residents were left without heat or electricity during one of the coldest nights of the winter. Without discussing it with anyone, I loaded my car with flashlights, batteries, and space heaters from Henderson's emergency stock and spent the evening checking on elderly neighbors and making sure everyone had what they needed to stay safe and warm. Victoria had been staying at Daniel's house, and when I returned around midnight, exhausted and covered in snow, she was waiting in the living room with hot coffee and a look of something approaching approval. "Daniel told me where you went," she said, handing me a mug. "That was kind of you." "It wasn't kind," I corrected her. "It was necessary. Mrs. Rodriguez is 83 and lives alone. Mr. Patterson has diabetes and needs to keep his medication refrigerated. People could have gotten hurt tonight." Most people would have assumed that someone else would take care of those problems. Most people in Millfield would have done exactly what I did. We look out for each other here. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, studying my face in the firelight. "I owe you an apology, Katie," she said finally. "I came here expecting to find someone who was either naive or opportunistic, someone who would either be overwhelmed by our family's wealth or who was trying to exploit it. I didn't expect to find someone who was genuinely secure in her own values and priorities." "I'm not perfect," I said, "but I know who I am, and I know what matters to me. Daniel is part of that, but he's not all of it." "Good," Victoria said firmly, "because anyone who defines themselves entirely through their relationship with another person, even my son, wouldn't be strong enough to be part of our family." It was the closest thing to acceptance I was likely to get from Victoria Richardson, and I found myself surprisingly grateful for it. The next morning, as Victoria prepared to return to Connecticut, she pulled me aside for one final conversation. "Katie, I want to be clear about something," she said. "If you marry Daniel, you'll be entering a world that can be challenging and sometimes unforgiving. There will be people who judge you, social situations that feel foreign, and pressures that you can't imagine. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about Marcus's years of criticism, about the investigation into my background, about the awkward conversations with reporters and business associates over the past few weeks. "Mrs. Richardson, I've already been judged and found wanting by people whose opinions shouldn't have mattered to me. I've learned that I can't control what other people think, but I can control how I respond to their judgments. If some people in your world can't accept me for who I am, that says more about them than it does about me. Victoria smiled, the first completely genuine smile I'd seen from her. You know, Katie, you might be exactly what this family needs. We've spent so many years focused on protecting our wealth and status that we've forgotten some more fundamental values. You could remind us what those look like. As her car pulled away from the curb, I realized that I'd passed some kind of test I hadn't even known I was taking. Victoria Richardson still had reservations about our engagement, but she was no longer actively opposing it. More importantly, she seemed to respect me as an individual rather than just seeing me as a threat to her son's future. Daniel found me standing on the porch, watching his mother's car disappear down the street. "How do you feel?" he asked, wrapping his arms around me from behind. "Like I just survived something important," I said, but also like I learned something about myself that I didn't know before. "What's that?" I leaned back against his chest, feeling more confident about our future than I had since the night his wealth was revealed. That I'm strong enough for whatever comes next. Your family, my family, the money, the attention, the judgment. I can handle all of it as long as we're handling it together. Daniel kissed the top of my head. "We are," he said simply. "Whatever comes next, we're in this together." The approval of Daniel's mother hadn't been the validation I'd thought I needed, but earning it had shown me that I was capable of standing my ground with anyone when it mattered. For the first time since this whole situation began, I felt truly ready to become part of the Richardson family, not because I'd changed to fit their expectations, but because I'd proven I was strong enough to be myself within their world. The hardest tests were behind us now, or so I thought. 6 months later, I stood in the bridal suite of the Millfield Country Club, looking at myself in the mirror and hardly recognizing the woman staring back at me. The wedding dress was simple but elegant, something I'd chosen myself despite Victoria's subtle suggestions about designers in New York. My hair was styled professionally, but I'd insisted on keeping it natural rather than the elaborate updo the wedding planner had recommended. Through the window, I could see guests arriving for what had become the social event of the year in Millfield. Daniel had wanted to keep the wedding small and intimate, but between his family's business associates, my community connections, and the media attention our engagement had generated, the guest list had grown to over 200 people. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," my mother said, adjusting my veil with tears in her eyes. My father stood quietly in the corner, looking handsome but slightly uncomfortable in his rented tuxedo. This level of formality was as foreign to him as it had been to me 6 months ago, but he'd embraced everything about the wedding with grace and enthusiasm. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, offering me his arm. Before I could answer, there was a soft knock on the door. My mother opened it to reveal Marcus, looking nervous and uncertain. "Katie, could I talk to you for just a minute?" I hadn't been sure Marcus would even come to the wedding. Our relationship had been slowly rebuilding over the past several months, but it was still fragile and complicated. He'd been true to his word about therapy, and our conversations had become more honest and less toxic, but I wasn't sure we'd ever fully repair the damage from all those years of cruelty. "Of course," I said, gesturing for my parents to give us some privacy. Marcus stepped into the room, looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something like wonder mixed with regret. "You look incredible," he said quietly, "like a real bride, not just my little sister playing dress-up." "Thank you," I replied, not sure where this conversation was heading. "Katie, I need to say something before you walk down that aisle," Marcus continued. "I've spent the last 6 months in therapy trying to understand why I treated you so badly for so many years, and I finally figured it out." He paused, gathering his courage for whatever confession was coming. "I was jealous of you," he said simply. "You were happy, genuinely happy, in a way I've never been able to achieve. You found meaning in your work, you built real relationships with people, you were content with your life. Meanwhile, I was chasing success and status and money, and none of it ever made me feel the way you looked when you were helping Mrs. Rodriguez fix her faucet or talking to customers at Henderson's." I felt tears starting to form in my eyes, but I didn't interrupt. "When Daniel turned out to be wealthy, it forced me to confront the fact that you'd found something I'd been searching for my whole life, someone who loved you for exactly who you are. I'd convinced myself that my way was the only way to be successful, but you proved me wrong, just by being yourself." Marcus took a deep breath before continuing.
I can't undo all the horrible things I said to you. I can't give you back those years when you questioned your own worth because of my cruelty.
But I want you to know that you were right all along about what matters in life, and I was wrong about everything. The tears were flowing freely now, and I reached out to hug my brother for the first time in years. He held me carefully, trying not to wrinkle my dress. "I forgive you," I whispered, "and I love you, even when you were being terrible to me." "I love you too," he said, "and I promise I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be the brother you deserve to have from the beginning." After Marcus left, I took a few minutes to compose myself and touch up my makeup. Through the window, I could see Daniel greeting guests on the lawn, looking handsome and confident in his tuxedo. Victoria and William Richardson stood nearby, having flown in with a contingent of family members and business associates who'd traveled from around the country for the wedding. The transformation in my relationship with Daniel's parents had been gradual but significant. Victoria now called me monthly to check in, and she'd become genuinely invested in my plans to pursue a business degree through an online program. William remained more reserved, but he'd started including me in conversations about business and investments, treating my opinions with respect even when we disagreed. "Katie, it's time," my father said, returning to escort me downstairs. The ceremony was held in the country club's garden, with white chairs arranged in neat rows facing an arch decorated with flowers from my mother's garden. As the music began and I walked down the aisle on my father's arm, I saw the faces of everyone who mattered to me, my parents beaming with pride, Daniel's family watching with genuine warmth, my coworkers from Henderson's looking slightly overwhelmed by the elegance but clearly happy for me. And there was Daniel, waiting for me at the altar with a smile that made everything else fade away. This was the man who'd seen my worth when I'd forgotten it myself, who'd defended me against his own family skepticism, who'd never once suggested that I needed to change to be worthy of his love. The ceremony itself was a blur of traditional vows, exchanged rings, and the minister's pronouncement that we were now husband and wife. But I remembered every detail of Daniel's face as we said our vows, the way his voice trembled slightly when he promised to love and honor me, the warmth of his hands as he slipped the wedding ring onto my finger. The reception was held in the country club's ballroom, transformed into something magical with flowers, candles, and soft lighting. Daniel and I had our first dance to a song we'd chosen together. Nothing fancy or classical, just something that reminded us of those early evenings spent talking on his porch while we were still getting to know each other. During the dinner, Daniel's best man gave a speech about how transformed Daniel had become since meeting me, how he'd become more grounded and genuinely happy. My maid of honor, Sarah from the bakery where I'd worked in high school, told embarrassing stories about my teenage years that had everyone laughing. But the speech that surprised me most came from Victoria Richardson. She stood up during the toasts, elegant in her mother of the groom dress, and looked directly at me. "When Daniel first told us about Katie, I'll admit I was skeptical," she began, causing some nervous laughter from guests who knew about our rocky start. "I was concerned that someone might be taking advantage of my son's success. What I discovered instead was a young woman who had already achieved something much more valuable than wealth. She'd built a life based on genuine relationships, meaningful work, and authentic values." Victoria paused, looking around the room at the mix of billionaire business associates and small-town hardware store customers sharing the same tables. "Katie didn't need to change to fit into our world," she continued. "Instead, she's helped our world remember what really matters. She's shown us that success isn't just about accumulating wealth or status, it's about the positive impact you have on other people's lives. Today, we're not just celebrating Daniel and Katie's marriage, we're celebrating the reminder that love, kindness, and integrity are still the most valuable things any of us can possess." The speech brought down the house, and I found myself crying again, happy tears this time, overwhelmed by how far we'd all come from that tense Christmas dinner where Victoria had barely been able to hide her disapproval. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, I found myself standing with Daniel on the country club's terrace, looking out over Millfield's twinkling lights.
In a few hours, we'd be flying to Italy for our honeymoon, but eventually we'd be coming back here, to the small town where we'd fallen in love and built our life together. Any regrets? Daniel asked, pulling me close. I thought about Marcus's prediction that I'd die alone and poor, about his certainty that no successful man would ever want someone like me. I thought about Victoria's initial conviction that I was either naive or opportunistic, about all the people who'd questioned whether our relationship could survive the revelation of Daniel's wealth. None, I said firmly, not a single one. Even though marrying me means dealing with all the complications that come with my family's money? I laughed, thinking about how much I'd grown over the past year. Daniel, I spent years letting my own brother convince me I wasn't good enough for anyone. If I can survive that and come out stronger, I think I can handle whatever challenges come with being part of the Richardson family. Daniel spun me around, my dress flowing out around us like something from a fairy tale. But this wasn't a fairy tale where the prince rescued the princess from poverty and obscurity. This was a real story about two people who'd found each other and built something genuine together, despite all the obstacles and skeptics and family drama. As we prepared to leave for our honeymoon, I realized that Marcus had been wrong about everything. I hadn't died alone and poor. I'd found love, respect, and a partnership that was worth more than any amount of money. But more importantly, I'd learned that my worth had never been dependent on anyone else's approval, not Marcus's, not Victoria's, not society. I was exactly who I'd always been, Katie Pemberton from Millfield, who worked at a hardware store and helped her neighbors and found meaning in simple, honest work. The only thing that had changed was that I'd finally learned to see myself the way Daniel saw me, the way people who truly knew me had always seen me. And that, I realized, was the most valuable discovery of all. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.